Hi there. Welcome to this Google Hangout on foreign fighters and Islamic State, a Google Hangout with 3 experts in the field of the phenomenon of foreign fighters and counterterrorism in general. And this Google Hangout is part of the massive open online course, Terrorism and Counterterrorism, comparing theory and practice. I've invited 3 colleagues that will discuss the issue from their point of view, and they relate to 3 levels at which you can study this phenomenon. One is on, let's say, the individual level. Who are these people? Why do they go? Why are they involved in, for instance, the fight in Syria? Then we look at the threat, for instance, posed by Islamic State to countries like the UK, so we focus more on the issue at the national level, and finally we'll look into the issue from an international perspective. Allow me to introduce the 3 key experts, the 3 colleagues who will each look at these different levels. Let's start with Daan Weggemans, who explored the issue from a individual perspective. Daan Weggemans is a research fellow at the Center for Terrorism and Counterterrorism here at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and he has done research into the people that go to Syria. He interviewed, together with a number of other colleagues, people that were close to these people that left for Syria or Iraq, to actually describe them. Like, who are these people? What motivated them? And he came up with a number of biographies that were published in the article in Perspectives on Terrorism. That is also among the list on the list of required reading of the massive open online course Terrorism and Counterterrorism. Currently, Daan is doing research on persons that have been arrested on terrorism-related charges. So he's the expert to look at this issue from the individual level. Then the next speaker will be Raffaello Pontucci, who is with the Royal United Service Institute that focuses on research on defense and security issues in London. He is a key expert in the field. He recently published an article or briefing paper, The Threat to IS to the UK. I think it was published just a few weeks ago, I think, or maybe just a few days ago. He has a research interest in actually a wide variety of security-related topics. He has been doing research in Shanghai, where he was a visiting scholar at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. So he's interested in security perspective, China and its Western neighbors. But today we invited him as a key expert in the field of the issue of foreign fighters and terrorism in general. And then the third speaker is my colleague Mark Singleton. He's the director of the International Center for Counterterrorism, also based in The Hague. He's a career diplomat over 25 years. He has been involved in various projects, various places. He's been in Afghanistan, many parts of Europe, and the last couple of years he was, and this is a long way to describe it, but I wanted to make it as clear as possible. He was the acting head of the mission to the office of the Quartet, representative of Tony Blair in Jerusalem. And to sum it up, trying to keep the peace process alive, if I may sum it up like that. Before that, he was also stationed in Afghanistan, where he was the political advisor to the ISAF commander in Kandahar in the south of Afghanistan. So he's been in a lot of places where different organizations try to somehow manage the conflict, the violence. So 3 excellent speakers with a different perspective and probably also a different take on this phenomenon. Let us start with the individual level. Daan, please. You have looked into especially Dutch cases, persons from the Netherlands who went to Syria. What's your take on this? Why did they go? What motivates them? And what are other key observations of your research?
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for this question. What I found during my research is a very mixed set of profiles, indicators, and stories, and this is one of the main findings I think is important to stress every time we study this topic, is that there is not one profile. The contexts differ, the stories differ, and I think that's an important starting point to say, well, in the Netherlands we find very different stories. So it's a hard topic to study. What do we know? We know that in the Netherlands there are many different individuals, but who have some things in common. So they are often under 25, the age of 25. They are often low educated, which I find is an interesting fact, since in different countries you also find that the people who leave for Syria are more often the same age but highly educated or in different socioeconomic classes. So in Holland we have quite people who are on the lower ends of society. Other things what I found is interesting is that when we look at radicalization processes and the act of preparation for a leave to Syria, is the fact that people are very, the people in the environment are often very unaware of the fact that their son or their daughter or their nephew or whoever is leaving, is preparing for a leave for Syria. So when we talk about prevention of radicalization or finding indicators of terrorism or extremism or whatever, it's very difficult to find those indicators for the people who are very close to them. So parents do not often know what their child is up to. They were caught by surprise when they found out that that their son had left or that their daughter had left. This is, I think, a very important finding because when we make policies on this topic and we stress that the people like parents or youth workers or police officers have a very important role in signaling radicalization, that it's actually in these stories that all the people I spoke to had a very hard time to signal radicalization, the phase of leaving to Syria. Other things is something which you find with other radicalization stories as well, so not particularly for Syria, is the idea that during the process of preparing for a leave for Syria, people are becoming more and more isolated from society. So when someone is moving towards a leave for Syria, people start to remove themselves more and more from society. So the distance between the individual and society grows bigger. At the same time, he becomes involved in radical networks. This is nothing new for Syria, but it's something which we also find in these kind of cases of foreign fighters. Let me see. Also, we found in some cases some cases of apathy. So people who feel more and more angry about what happens in Syria, but also feel less and less concerned with the facts that their lives are in the Netherlands not as they want to be. So they are more starting to focus on the situation in Syria. But also in some cases we found cases of trauma. People who got traumatized because some kind of serious event in their lives, the death of a loved one or some other things, can have a significant impact on the course of a radicalization process. In all cases, the stories are very different, so I think that's important to stress that we do not find a single profile. The thing we found is actually the complexity of all those stories and all those different radicalization processes. When we want to train or when we want to make people aware of the idea of radicalization, we need to stress this idea that it's a very complex idea, that there's not a single indicator. But there is a complex situation in which someone radicalizes. What I think is, when I've got the floor now, is it's important also to try and research these kinds of topics as much as possible, also on a micro level. So on focusing on not neglecting the social or the meso or the macro level, but also trying to focus what goes on the lives of people and try to gather as much, and I would like to invite everybody who's watching as well, try to gather as much empirical data as possible. So the use of the needs, probably in the course it has been discussed as well, the need for primary sources is very urgent. And those primary sources you do not only have to find in talking to former extremists or talking to terrorists. I think is a very important part of the job. I like to do that myself as well. But you can also find empirical data from other sources, and this is what we did in our research. We tried to interview as much people as possible surrounding the person who left for Syria. So the persons who, the parents, the people who were teaching these foreign fighters before they left, the police officers, youth workers, everybody we could imagine. We tried to interview and try to ask them, what did you perceive at this and this point? How do you perceive the radicalization and the preparation? This is a very important source for us researchers to understand this phenomenon. And also, and I think that's a final point, there's also a lot of information on social networks, on Facebook and on Twitter. Many of these guys, you get a perfect insight in their lives to a certain extent, let me say that as well, about what they are thinking about, what goes on in their minds or what they're occupied with. So when you study people's Facebooks and when you study the micro level, you can also find something of an insight in their narrative, what's important for them. So I found a situation in which actually you find three kinds of stories on their Facebooks on three kinds of topics. The first topic I found together with my colleague Peter Groen and with Edwin Bakker is the idea of the martyrdom, let me say it like that. The martyrdom of when you're going to fight in Syria, those people are very occupied by the idea of becoming a martyr. It is a very important topic. The second topic is heroism on the battlefield. So when you go to the battlefield, when you're joining the fight, it's very important to be discussing this in terms of heroism. It's an heroic act of joining the Syrian foreign fighters. And the last part, and it's also very interesting, I guess, is that people are very occupied with the fights and the discussions about which parties are the right parties in the fight. So the discussions about should you support Jabhat al-Nusra or should you support ISIS or should you support none of them. So the idea of fitna between those groups, I think, is a very important topic which comes to the table very often. So to conclude, I would really like to invite everybody to make some kind of study on this topic, also on the micro level, so we can compare. Are these profiles which we found, which are not really profiles, but are these stories very different stories in the UK than in Holland, than in Germany, and etc. So I think it's also important for us to compare these kind of stories.
Yeah, thank you, Daan, and thank you for this call upon other researchers to look into cases in their countries and then to compare data. Well, of course, this Google Hangout is a great way to also compare and compare notes. And of course, I feel I guess I would like to hear Rafael Pontucci, who has also studied the case of the UK, who's an expert in the field. I think you're also asked to contribute to the discussions in Parliament in the UK, I think later this week, or you did that today actually. So what's your take on that? You know the case of the UK very well. You've been very often also on television, radio explaining it. Do you recognize some of these features, some of these dilemmas that Daan has just put forward?
Thank you very much, Edwin, for the invitation to do this, and hello everybody, and thank you so much for the last presentation, which I think was fascinating and a particularly interesting example of comparing the differences between the different case studies. As our colleague just mentioned, the picture with Holland seems to be focused around people being relatively less well educated. Well, that's an interesting aspect that we don't actually see reflected in the British case studies. In the British case studies, the current estimate seems to be we're seeing somewhere in the region of 1,000 or so people, though the exact numbers are very vague in general. And you know, there's some broad trends that we can see amongst this community, but they seem to be really quite generalized. And one, however, that I think does seem to be does recur is the fact that people do seem to be relatively well educated. We've seen quite a few people with respectable paths on their way to respectable degrees at good universities who've instead decided to go off and fight in Syria or Iraq. We've also seen a lot of women going over there, which has been quite interesting, and the youth of some of these women has been something that's particularly concerning our security services here. But I think what's most interesting to me, looking at the sort of the broad body of case studies that we've seen in the UK in particular, is the fact that it's actually a very wide range of people. And I think it's very difficult to draw an absolute profile down. And I think that's something echoed in a lot of the research that we've seen around this question, which has basically said that it's very difficult to define exactly what it is we're talking about when we're looking at the body of people who are being drawn to be foreign fighters. You know, there is a broad cluster, I would argue, somewhere between about 18 and probably 30, and that seems to be where the majority reside, but we've seen outliers in both directions. I think the one big takeaway that seems to exist in the British case is that if we look at the numbers and the sort of ethnicities they come from, it does, you know, very broadly speaking, track Britain's sort of ethnic Muslim community, though we do see an overrepresentation of converts amongst the bigger community of people who we're seeing go over there, which is, I think, an interesting aspect. A very interesting aspect sitting here in London that has been noticeable in particular of late is the fact that we've seen something of a change in the critical geographical focus. So we still see a lot of people coming from across London, in particular East London, where there's a very substantial Muslim community. But there's recently been a particular focus on West London and a particular part of West London, and a mosque around, there's a cluster of sort of Arab and Somali mosques around which there seems to be more activity than we've seen in other situations. It's not exactly clear why this is happening at the moment, but it's a very interesting sort of phenomenon that I think is reflective of a slight difference that we're seeing in particular of the people who are going out to Syria. In terms of where Brits are going to go and join which groups, the majority, the steer we get is the majority seem to be going to join ISIS, but you know, that's not a rigid rule. We've seen a lot of people going over to join other groups like Jabhat al-Nusra or some of the other sort of foreign fighter brigades under that. And you know, Brits were going out to Syria and Iraq very early. I think as late as late 2011 we saw first evidence of British nationals going out there, and so those people were going before you even had all these divisions between Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS and all the other groups, and Ahrar al-Sham. So in some ways, we've got people who've been associated with some of these groups for quite some time now, a few years, and some who've risen to quite senior positions. And so that sort of complicates a little bit the picture when we're saying that they're going out there to join ISIS. People who are going now, who are going out to join ISIS, are going out to know what they're joining. But there are people who've kind of been, you could put it like grandfathered in to a group like ISIS simply because that was the group that they joined when they first went out there all those years ago, but it was a very different sort of creation. So, I mean, that kind of gives you, I think, a broad sense of the British picture. And I'll put that to one side and be happy to go into it in greater detail in the question and answer. But I thought the other aspect, which I thought might be useful to touch upon, would be the sort of threat picture coming back. And I'd like to do that.
Sorry, may I reserve
Sure. No.
later and see if there's, Jeanine, are there any questions from the audience?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions from the audience. One is by Dean Roth, and he asked about individual foreign fighters. So should we call them mercenaries, or are they driven by idealism? So to what extent do they really go there for religious reasons or to help people, or are they just going there for adventure or to get paid? So anyone?
Yeah, Daan, maybe what's your experience so far if you look at the Dutch cases?
I haven't really found, for the Dutch case, I haven't really found any, or not much cases of where there was a clear sum of money involved or anything where people get sponsored to leave. There are rumors that people are being helped, that there are people being paid for their tickets and etc., but not quite as clearly as you can call them mercenaries, that people are getting paid to join the fight. Perhaps there are, but I'm not sure if it's the case for the Netherlands at the moment.
I guess if you talk about mercenaries, you talk more about also private military companies. Maybe Mark, have you come across? This is more also at the international level, because we're talking now about individuals, foreign fighters that go there very often for political or political religious reasons. But we know that also, if you look at this issue, especially Syria and Iraq, from an international level, you see, of course, a wide range of actors, and not all are non-state actors, not all are individuals. You have private military companies, you have military advisors of certain countries that are involved. So if you would, maybe from your international perspective, what would be, let's say, aren't we narrowing down this whole discussion about IS, about Iraq and Syria, by only looking at these individuals from Western countries, from the Middle Eastern countries, but we should also perhaps include all the other players? Could you say a little bit more about the other players that, I would say, complicate the picture?
Thank you, Edwin, and thank you also for the 2 introductions so far. When it comes to, let's say, the conflicts in Syria and Iraq, particularly, which is obviously very much on our mind right now, I think you'll have a very diffuse picture. There are individuals attracted, but I'm sure, and I'm hearing the same rumors, I suppose, as others, that that there are also, let's say, groups involved who go there basically to, as a sort of moving army from one conflict to another. Well, in the development world, you have conflict junkies, and I'm sure that in this in foreign fighters, you also have conflict junkies that literally just follow the money and follow the trail. Again, it's very hard to identify exact numbers and exact origin, because there's very little solid intelligence on the ground that we can go by in this particular case. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I guess we use different terms. So foreign fighters in general could also be, let's say, an Iraqi Shia militia fighting in Syria. Or you could even call Hezbollah a foreign fighter group in Syria. But I guess we will limit our discussion here in this Google Hangout to foreign, maybe we would call them foreign jihadi fighters that are joining non-governmental organizations, let's say on the side that fights against the regime in Damascus or the government in Baghdad. But there's different ways, and the term foreign fighters is perhaps a little bit too broad. May I now move to let's say the next level, the national level, and especially a thing that is on the mind of not only the UK government but many governments that are confronted with people who join the fight in Syria. Number one country the top 5 is not the UK, but that's Tunisia, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Morocco. Also, these countries face a lot, or are confronted with a lot of their citizens that joined the fight in Syria. But within the European Union, the UK is one of the countries that has the most foreign fighters in Syria and is, of course, worried about that. Raffaello, could you please tell us a little bit more about the potential threat of these foreign fighters in general, and maybe IS, Islamic State, in general? You just published together with Alice Clare a paper on that. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on this issue.
Of course, thank you, Edwin. I suppose in terms of the sort of threat picture coming back, I think you make a very good point of distinguishing between the sort of threat and potential danger that we might see in places like North Africa or further afield in places like Indonesia, where as compared to the threat from the foreign fighters that we're seeing going back to Europe. I think within a European context, the threat picture seems to be focused in some ways, I would argue, around 4 different kind of models of threat coming back, and this is very much based on historical experience of how these sorts of foreign fighter flows have produced threats back. I think the most obvious one, and the one that people sort of most frequently get concerned about, is the directed threat, as in the individuals who sort of have been out there, have experience, connect with a specific group that then tasks them to come back and launch some sort of a terrorist attack. And a historical example of this would be, for example, the July 7 bombings in London. And that's the one that I think where, the security services worry about, in particular, probably more in the direction of the sort of Al-Qaeda affiliated groups that we're seeing out there. At the moment, from the analysis that we've done, the evidence of it coming from ISIS associated groups seems to be less. So far, it's not totally clear that ISIS has begun tasking people to come back and launch attacks. In some ways, what our understanding of the sort of threat picture in terms of coming back that might be connected and assessed to ISIS is more along the lines of what you could characterize as sort of self-starter threats. These would be individuals who are sort of associated with the group or connect with the group or part of a battalion that's sort of fighting under the group that, decides to come back and do something much more under their own steam. And certainly I think a lot of the plotting that we've seen seems to be into this kind of space. It seems to be the sort of direct aspect of people being sent back with specific instructions seems to be relatively limited. Instead, what we're seeing is individuals who are associated with ISIS who decide to come back and launch an attack more under their own steam. And I think I would argue Mehdi Namouche in Belgium would be one example of this, and I think some of the plotting we've seen in the United Kingdom certainly seems to be in this direction as well. The other two aspects I'll highlight, and I could probably deal with much more quickly than that, is the sort of potential for individuals who have been foreign fighters to come back and become radicalizing agents back within their home countries and sort of spreading the ideas further. Once you've got a young guy who's been out there, who's maybe got a piece of shrapnel in his leg, who's got battle stories and war scars, this becomes a very inspirational figure in certain communities, and that can sort of help spread the radical ideas further and in some ways prolong the problem that we're seeing. And then the final one I'll mention, which I think is important in a context that I didn't touch upon before, is the criminal aspect. And what we've seen in a number of cases, in the UK in particular, I know in Holland as well, there have been some sort of criminal networks. And I don't think we're dealing with, very organized, criminal networks on the level of, mafia type things. But, in terms of sort of gangs and maybe petty criminals, involved in drug dealing or other petty criminal activity of this kind, where some of those individuals are being drawn to go out to Syria. Well, what's interesting is some of these cases, we've seen some of these people come back and basically use their old criminal activity to try to raise money to try to go back out to Syria. In the UK, they've just disrupted a plot here in London, where at least one of the guys had been on remand previously for possession of a firearm, which, of course, from a security service perspective is very concerning, because then you're looking at, radicalized networks with links to battlefields that have access to weapons. And if you have access to weapons, then, that puts you in a different sort of threat category. So, I mean, those are the ones that we're particularly sort of focusing on as ways that the flow might transform into a threat back here. In terms of the final question I'll touch upon about ISIS and does ISIS want to launch sorts of attacks back, I think our assessment is at this point, it's not completely clear. It's not clear that ISIS has really made the strategic decision that it wants to start launching directed attacks way outside its territory. If we look back at the group's history, and we go way back to it as an organization that Zarqawi created in the sort of 90s out in Herat, it was a group that was very much focused on the Levant back then as well. And there's an argument that says that it so far hasn't really demonstrated much of an interest in doing sort of big, large-scale attacks outside this territory yet, and it might still be focused on more sort of consolidating its hold on its territory there. And if we were to see attacks out, they might be more sort of regional attacks, so something near Jordan or Turkey or Lebanon, for example, rather than a large-scale attack back somewhere in a European country. However, I think it's very important to point out that that could change. And the danger that we often worry about we wonder about is the potential for, ISIS is quite a hierarchical group, but it's quite devolved in some ways. And there's this potential risk that maybe a sort of a leadership figure at a more middle to lower level might instigate some sort of attack abroad that then would look like it had come as a direction from the top without necessarily actually being there. And that sort of muddying picture would maybe make our response being more directed at the group, whereas in fact it was maybe more sort of faction within the group. But it's a very difficult picture to pin down for certain right now.
Okay, thank you very much. So the three types of threat, the directed threat or self-starters that do something, radicalizing agents, veterans that have an appeal and can maybe convince others to either join the fight or further radicalize certain groups in society, and then the criminal networks. Here in the Netherlands, the national police is also worried that some of these people have skills and access to weapons that might be very of interest to the very violent organized crime that and that might worry especially people who are in the truck to deliver money and valuable stuff, that they might be confronted now with people who have really the skills and the practice to really use RPGs and stuff like that. Also, I think it's very important that you put a question mark to what extent IS or ISIS, Islamic State or Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, poses a direct threat. It could change, but we should be careful. And you also mentioned that neighboring countries are probably or possibly at a higher risk. It's showing a wide variety of different types of threats. Either the very criminal scenes that develop into more violent organizations, to communities that are at risk because of veterans returning, and then maybe a direct threat to countries of origin or neighboring countries. So thank you very much for that. Again, I'd recommend the briefing paper of RUSI, and you have more frequent publications. So visit their website for more information. You and your team are actually publishing a lot in this field, and it's always very topical. So that will be also my suggestion for those that follow the course. May I ask the reaction of maybe some of the other panelists, or is there a question from the audience regarding the threat posed by foreign jihadi fighters and Islamic State?
If I may, I would like to respond to what was just said. I think there are some excellent points which I really recognize in my own work. One thing I do not recognize is the idea or the risk of people returning from Syria and bragging about it or trying to spread the ideology and their views and their experience over here. What I found in my within my group or within my research group of individuals who hold a very radical thought is, and who have been to Syria, that they're actually quite scared in trying to share these ideas because they're afraid of being prosecuted for this. And this is a reason which in Holland people are very hesitant about bragging or showing off with their experience on the battleground. This might change, and this might also happen underground, so where we're not aware of what's happening. But I think that's an interesting idea, and yeah, thank you.
Of course, it depends very much on numbers. In the Netherlands, about 30, maybe 40 people have returned. I think in the UK it might be more than 200, 260. I heard figures like that by your colleague Shiraz Maher. He was talking about 260 returnees. I mean, that's a huge difference. That's 10 times as large and in a larger country. So, but are these figures correct?
Yeah. I mean, numbers that we're seeing, those are the official figures, that 250 people have come back. And if we look at the number of arrests, we're talking, I think there have been around 80 arrests so far. So that would suggest that there's up to 100, and my math is awful here, 120 or so who are still theoretically out there and of potential concern. I think the thing to note is that it's not entirely clear how complete these pictures are and what actually these people who've returned and what's happened to them subsequently. Some it's believed have gone back out again. Others seem to have basically been assessed and concluded that they weren't necessarily the sort of threat that we need to worry about. Others, there's a belief have probably been picked up for other things. I think Daan makes a very interesting point about people coming back and showing off about it, and I think this is something that is very difficult in terms of getting access to people and talking to people about what actually people have actually been out there and who are willing to come back and admit to it. It's true that that's difficult, but I think the point about people becoming radicalizing agents, that is something that we've seen. Now, within a Syrian context, we've certainly seen that individuals have come back and helped spread the ideas amongst others, because we're seeing one of the interesting phenomena that we've seen is that there does seem to be clusters of where these people are coming from. And in some, it's places that we've known and long known about, but others are sort of more interesting. And this West London phenomenon that we've had in the UK in particular suggests that there is a level of communication that's going on there and a level of sort of braggadocio that is sort of inspiring people. And certainly in some of the cases we've seen in the UK, there's been clear evidence that individuals who've been out there have been helping inspire others, who then been collecting others around them to then try to go out there. So there is some element of it, though I think that Dan is right. It is very difficult to get sometimes access to that because people are very wary because the legislation has been very hard. But as to your question about the numbers, yes, 250 is the number that is currently used by the security services. The suspicion is it's probably a bit higher than that, but it's also unclear how many of these people have since gone back again.
Well, of course, a number of countries in the Middle East are even more worried because the number of people that left, for instance, from Tunisia, 3,000, is probably as much as all the EU member states. So the latest assessment by the EU Counter-Terrorism coordinator is that 3,000 citizens or residents of the European Union left for Syria, and relatively small Tunisia is facing similar numbers. So try to imagine worries in Tunis about this phenomena. Raffaello, you pointed out the potential threat of IS or ISIS that's very much focused on the Levant. The region of covering Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. Mark, you've lived actually quite some time in that part of the world. Probably you follow the news and also have an interest in their perspectives. Do you see worries also in, let's say, Jordan, Palestinian territories, and Israel?
With regard to the bragging issue, definitely. I think street credibility amongst your peers in these places is very important. It affects people's choices and behavior, and it actually gives you status and power that you otherwise would probably not achieve. So in that respect, yes, and just the sheer numbers also illustrates, I think, the attraction that returning foreign fighters, but also the fighting itself has on people in the region. Israel, obviously, less so. Their concern is more about the effect that it would have on their neighbors, as well as, let's say, the Arab Israelis, as they call them, which amount to about 20% of their population.
Jeanine, are there any questions from the audience that relate to the threat posed by IS and foreign fighters to countries of origin or neighboring countries?
Yeah, there is actually a question from Alexander Niklan, and he says, well, there are around 15,000 foreign fighters now fighting in Syria and the region, and at some point the fight will stop, and they have to go somewhere. So how should we treat those people who return? So maybe not also the people in Tunisia, but also people who come back through the UK. How should we de-radicalize them? Should we do that? Or how should we make sure that it won't be the case like what happened with Afghanistan in the 1980s and other cases? So how should we treat returning fighters?
Question that is easy to formulate and I guess very difficult to answer. I'm not sure who to give the floor to answer this very extremely difficult question that is related to both high numbers, past experiences, and probably limited capacity of all countries involved, even the UK and the Netherlands, let alone Tunisia and a number of other countries. And I'm not sure, if I look at the Netherlands, if we're really already, well, we're of course worried about returnees. We're dealing with 30 now, maybe we have to deal with 100. But what if all come back, or let's say 80% of them come back? Maybe 20% dies. But what are we going to do about these people? Jeanine, as you know yourself, you've studied also past cases. You also found out that some of them stay in the country where they have been fighting. Some move on to other battlefields. But we know that whatever happens and how long, whatever the time period of the fighting, the majority most likely will return, and not only to their country of origin, but many, also Tunisians and maybe Jordanese and other people, will go to Europe in the end. So maybe, Raffaello, maybe this question, maybe you're most, you're the person maybe to ask first for a reaction to this, let's say, long-term phenomenon. Currently there are already people going back, but in the future there might be, well, maybe thousands that want to go back to Europe, and maybe a lot of them end up in your town. So does that worry you?
Yes, I mean, it certainly does. I think I think there's a reason why this is the principal concern, I would argue, of most European security services, I think this has been on their agenda for some time, and it's just escalated, frankly, as time has gone on. When you're looking at basically every other context where you've had sort of fighters go from Western countries to these sorts of battlefields, to battlefields that have this kind of flavor, they've all produced some sort of a terrorist threat. And so the question has always been very much more along the lines of, well, when will it happen, rather than if it will happen. And we've already started, I would argue, to see it happening in some ways, shapes, and forms. I think there is, at the same time as saying all of that, a potential risk in worrying, in sort of over-exaggerating the threat. Now, we can certainly say that there is some sort of a threat, but can we say that all, now let's take the number 1,000 of those from the United Kingdom, for example, let's say it's 1,000 who've gone out there are going to come back and pose a threat. Well, if we look at history, we'll see that that doesn't always shake out like that. In some cases it does. Some people need to be dealt with in other ways. Some people end up, Mark mentioned earlier this idea of sort of itinerant jihadists. You know, these sorts of mobile fighters who go from one battlefield to another. Well, we've certainly seen that happen in other contexts. And those people, for the most part, become essentially problems elsewhere. They don't tend to come back here. They tend to come back and they tend to maybe draw funding and maybe other recruits as well, but they don't necessarily produce terrorist plots. I think, you know, that's some of them. Some people come back and just go back to ordinary lives. We've had thousands who went to Afghanistan in the past from the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom had a particular connection with Afghanistan because of the South Asian, the substantial Pakistani South Asian community here. And so we've had a lot of people who've gone out there who've had some experience, who've come back and haven't really presented a terrorist threat in a particular context in the United Kingdom. So I think all of these factors need to be borne in mind to say that, you know, yes, this is a danger, and yes, we are going to see problems coming back, but to not make sure, you know, and this is something that Shiraz in particular and others have made a very big point about talking about, they're saying that all of these guys are going to come back and be a terrorist threat. Some of them will be, but not all of them. And we need to figure out ways of trying to distinguish, and I think that's where a lot of the work is trying to be done at the moment, to try to develop sort of counter-radicalization and de-radicalization programs that are credible, that are really helping some of these people maybe reintegrate into society, rather than simply assuming that they're all going to come back and pose a direct terrorist threat, because it's simply not the case. I think if we track back a little bit to talk about the motivations that we've seen people go out there for, it's a very wide range. You know, we see some people who are drawn very much by the sorts of religious and utopian ideas that are going on out there. We're seeing other people who are more in the kind of sociopath brand, who are just drawn by the idea of going to participate in a fight. And others are just getting caught up in something and sort of getting swept along in it. And, you know, different parts of those will be a threat. And, you know, I think the difficulty for a security service is going to be is how do you distinguish? I mean, this has already been a problem that we've certainly had in the United Kingdom. We've got a sort of substantial pool of radical people that have presented a problem or have been a concern for a long time. Some of them turn into terrorist threats and actual problems, but some of them kind of don't, and it kind of fades off. They kind of grow up, if you will. And it's just very difficult from a security service perspective to distinguish it. And the problem, what you're seeing happening in Syria and Iraq, is that that pool of people is becoming much bigger, and, as Edwin very correctly pointed out, are becoming trained in potentially really quite dangerous skills. And I think that mix is what's really enhanced the levels of concern.
Thank you. Well, this is, of course, an issue that's on the agenda of many countries, and it requires much more information on, well, both knowing why individuals go, why they come back, but we also need to share information. We have to share intelligence if we want to be prepared for this phenomenon when a lot of them, more of them, will return. So it's high on the international agenda. I think it's time also to move to that perspective, the international perspective. This is really a truly global phenomenon. We have people from Canada to Australia that move to Syria to join the fight, or in Iraq, Philippines, Morocco, Chechnya, a wide range of countries. So how does that, how does this international agenda develop? Who are key players? Mark, you look at this from more of an international perspective. You visit places like, you just came back from New York, Washington. You've been yourself in the region working on a number of issues that relate to conflict and violence, complicated issues. What's your take on this?
Thank you very much, Edwin. well, before I go into, let's say, the international response, particularly in the context of the foreign fighters itself, it's very much now triggered by what's happening in the Middle East. So, just to put a bit of a scene setter out there with regard to the Middle East and what that means also for the international response and the possibilities, but also the limitations to that. Just a few words on that particular situation, if I can call it that. You can argue that all politics are local, but the wider Middle East, and I'm moving, let's say, from Northern Africa, MENA region into the Gulf and Iran. This is a laboratory, basically, where local, national, regional, and global politics are all very much intertwined. And this is also a region where hard-nosed conflict has been prevalent for centuries, if not longer. And in a way, and forgive me the terminology here, but the cutthroat politics must have been invented in that part of the world. It's also an area where global spheres of influence are still very much contested, and where countries in the region for past decades are contesting each other and trying to gain or regain a role as a sort of regional superpower. Israel, but also Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar nowadays, Syria in the past. They're all building alliances alliances of convenience with others in the region to shift the balance of power in their favor. This is also a region where the logic of international politics don't apply. The enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend, as we see in the case of Iran, for instance. It's also an area where the winner takes all, autocratic rule, be it at the local level, be it at the national level, is predominant, and where fostering political inclusion, which is in the international community's jargon the way forward, is often seen as a sign of weakness rather than strength. Unfortunately, it's also a region where, let's say, multilateral mechanisms, local multilateral mechanisms, I could call it that, like the League of Arab States, are totally ineffective in trying to resolve conflict and bring stability. And also where the UN, and that brings us to the New York agenda, simply because the interests in this part of the world are so deeply rooted and are so large in size and scope, the UN has very little clout to actually play the role of honest broker and actually bring parties together and agree on a sort of political agenda. So that's just to describe the complexities of the places we're talking about here. So we're in a region where chaos, conflict, insecurity is today's reality, and it has been so for the past decades, if not longer, where the functions of the state have been eroding, where ISIS nowadays, but before al-Nusra, where the Kurds, where in a way the hybrid organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah have been able to fill a vacuum, a political and security vacuum, preying in a way on long-standing ethnic, tribal, religious, cultural, socio-economic grievances. And it's therefore also a region where the international community can only burn its fingers if it gets involved, and which is probably one of the reasons why President Obama, in his first years in office, decided that this is not a part of the world that I want to get involved in. On the contrary, I want to get out. But if you look at what happened over the past months, he had very little choice in a way. The beheading of U.S. citizens, and this is how U.S. politics play out often, he just had no choice but to act. Difficult as it was, he sent John Kerry to the region to build a coalition. He basically bullied Prime Minister Maliki out of office so that a more inclusive style leader would come in and then invite the US to take action. And last but not least, he also pushed a foreign fighters resolution through the UN Security Council. So where does that leave us right now? I mean, the campaign against ISIS right now, as we see it, is mainly a military campaign. What we miss here, and it's not the first time in the region, is a sound and realistic political strategy. Even if there were one, and let's assume it is, it's built on a lot of wishful thinking, unfortunately, that, for instance, the new Iraqi government would be all-inclusive. Well, I don't know if that's going to happen. Let's hope so. That the Turks and the Kurds will somehow bury their differences. Then these are grievances that have been, this is a strategic political struggle that determines Turkish action for sure. That the UN will rise out of the ashes and convince Assad to step down and have the Russians consent to that. And to have Iran and Israel not interfere. This and more. Qatar and Saudi Arabia are at loggerheads, even though they're both part of the coalition. So we're building our political strategy as we speak. In the meantime, we have a military strategy, which at best is one of containment, it seems, pushing ISIS back into towns, villages under their control, hoping that their sphere of influence will diminish. And in the meantime, again, very ambitious planning. In 6 months or 9 months' time, we'll have a competent local force that is made up of Iraqi security forces, who, by the way, are amongst the best trained in the region. They were the best equipped, but they lost a lot of their equipment to ISIS. And also the so-called moderate Syrian opposition, whose loyalty is probably less with the West and more with the land, whose key concern is to oust Assad, but not necessarily in the way we would like it. So that is basically the sort of marshland that we're now confronted with, and with the risk of civilian casualties growing by the day. After all, we hardly have any serious intelligence on the ground that can help us deliver let's say, a targeted campaign in the way you could argue Israel manages to do when it deals with Hamas. Coalition forces are wary, and as a result of that, we are entering into a prolonged, protracted conflict that is open-ended, and that will most likely increase rather than decrease the foreign fighter phenomenon. Now, having said all this, where does that bring us with regard to the international response to foreign fighters in particular? Well, if you look at the resolution itself, although it pays a lot of, in my view, lip service to prevention and to the rule of law and the respect of human rights, etc., it is actually very, very outspoken in terms of criminalizing particular action, including the recruitment, but also returning, which may well deter people rather than make it more attractive for them to come back and then reintegrate within society. It is also ambiguous in its language with regard to the respect for human rights, which at the end of the day is most likely going to backfire. It brings us back to, in a way, the situation in 2001, immediately after the 9/11 attacks, when resolutions were passed in the UN which were, triggered by the need to show resolve, but actually, if you look back, didn't deliver that much. And instead, what we see is that later resolutions that the UN passed, which focus much more on issues of prevention, respect for human rights, rule of law, reintegration, rehabilitation, etc., which made much more sense in the longer term, have now seemingly been pushed aside, and that brings back memories of the past, but it also makes you wonder, well, what are we actually doing? I wish we had the answers. You started off your introductory remarks by saying we will have peace after an hour's Google Hangout. I'm afraid I'm not as optimistic as you are.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, you describe it as a marshland, and I tend to agree. If you look at it also and include the international level and what's going on, and the picture gets even more complicated. And Also with an eye on the clock, I would try to wrap up a number of things. I mean, this issue of foreign fighters, IS, the situation in Syria and Iraq is highly complicated. And it's got many aspects. It's got so many stakeholders. It's got so many different parties who have a different view on this, also have a different way of defining what is the problem. What is the main problem? Is it the main problem to the families, to societies, to the countries of origin, or the citizens, the poor citizens of Syria that are confronted with Europeans fighting there, being part of groups that are involved in actions that some have described as genocide. So there's a wide range of shareholders, a wide range of ways to define what is the problem, what is at stake. It's also constantly changing, so highly complicated. Well, in the 1970s, two scholars, Ritter and Weber, have called these kind of issues that governments have to deal with, they have called it a wicked problem. And if I have to mention one country that is extremely wicked and that's very high on the agenda, it's this issue. It's an issue that's on the agenda within neighborhoods and local governments all the way up to the UN. And of course we will not find an answer. Even if we discuss this in 1,000 hours, we will not find a solution. But I would like to ask the three speakers, the three experts, that from their perspective to answer actually the following basic problems. If you have to pick out one issue, what would be the key problem that you would mention as looking at the issue of phenomenal foreign fighters from your perspectives? Let's say the individual level, local level, or national level, or international level. What's the key problem? What's the key stakeholder? And then, not sure if I want to ask that question, but if you had to pick out one type of measure, what would that measure be? So, what's the key problem? Who's the key stakeholder, and what should that stakeholder do? Knowing that we need probably a long-term, wide approach, we have to try many different ways to try to deal with this issue. It's probably not an issue that we can ever solve. It's muddling through this marshland described by Mark Singleton. But if you had to pick out from your research or your perspective, what is the key problem in your eyes? What is the key stakeholder? And what should be a key policy that should definitely be included into this wider approach? Daan, may I ask you first? So let's go from the individual local level to the national and then to the international level. Please, Daan.
It's a horrible, difficult question, especially at the micro level. I think the main problem at this point is our lack of knowledge and our lack of experience of understanding why people leave, but also understanding about how people come back. The difficulties in framing and trying to work with people who came back. So I would say that the lack of knowledge and experience is the main problem about how to deal correctly, effectively with this situation. And it's a topic which governments and local officials are very much confronted with. And then the most horrible answer will come. What will be the perfect way to deal with this is a tailor-made approach. I'm sorry for using the word, but looking case by case, and in Holland we got the luxury of having small numbers, so we have the luxury of using this tailor-made approach. But seeing what kind of threat is used and people are so this kind of topic, so what kind of threat is there and how to deal with this kind of threat, to neutralize it or to assist, and this is also an option, to assist with the reintegration and support him in this process.
Thank you, Daan. So we need to have a better understanding of what's going on, and we need that also for a tailor-made approach. This, in the end, in some countries where the numbers are a bit lower, you could still maybe have the luxury to look at it from the individual level, and then each individual has gone for different reasons, has returned for different reasons, and see if you can have a tailor-made approach. How is that in, let's say, from the UK perspective, with a lot of higher numbers, and maybe you have a different idea about what is the problem, who should be the key stakeholder, and what should that organization or authority do?
I think, as Dan correctly said, and as you correctly said, this is a very difficult question, and it is because I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all approach. I think the fact that you've both basically circled around the fact that countries with smaller populations have a kind of easier way, though I would say it's really not actually that easy, but it's just more focused, is that you're dealing with a smaller group of people, so it's easier to know, you know, you're just dealing with a much more shrunken problem. For me, in some ways, the one aspect which I find quite worrying is in some ways what we see as the naivete around some of the people who are being drawn out there. I don't think there's a total understanding of what exactly they're going to join in some cases, and I think this is one of the key problems, in that I think we're seeing some people who are being drawn out there who are being drawn for, in many ways, what we might see as quite noble reasons. You know, they're being drawn because they're seeing, you know, the poor Syrian people suffering under the evil Assad regime, and they think it's their duty to go do something. These are young men, so young men are very excited to go take up arms and participate. And in some ways, that's, you know, a noble calling that we can see echoed in lots of other ways that we wouldn't necessarily criminalize. The problem is that what they're going to join is not a very, in the end, noble group, which really complicates the picture. And I don't think it's understood, frankly, well enough amongst the community people who are going out there, but also more broadly amongst communities generally. I think communities in general tend not to necessarily understand that maybe people are going out there with noble intentions, but they're becoming quite quickly drawn in to groups that are really not have, you know, whose actual end goal is frankly one of attacking the West or doing some, or beheading people in these horrible ways on international television. And I think that aspect is something that is quite important, does need to be strengthened. And I think part of that, and if we're going to focus around a policy here, I think that there is still a need for Western governments to define a little bit more clearly what their stake and what their policy in this is. You know, if I look at the United Kingdom, you know, it's easy to see this sort of confusion. We have the government is against the Assad regime. It has come out quite openly against the Assad regime in a number of contexts, and these people are going to fight against the Assad regime. Why is it that they're criminalized while the government is not? I can understand where this dissonance comes from. And in part, I think this is due to a kind of a failure to really clearly enunciate what the policy is, what it means, and what the implications are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raffaello. That's very much also my take in the discussion in the Netherlands. Be clear, what is your policy, your foreign policy, and why. Also explain why we want the Assad regime. I mean, that's the official line of the Netherlands, to be removed, but that it's not up to individuals to join whatever kind of group they like. So raising also awareness among communities, the awareness of what kind of groups are out there, and that they're not all fighting for this noble cause to just only topple the regime, and at the same time be very clear about one's country's position and explain why certain things are allowed and others are not. So thank you for that. Mark.
Thank you. I'll echo the comments made by my colleagues. Great questions. Terrible answers. I think perhaps the key risk or the key problem facing us now is that we're not learning anything from past experiences, and that our knee-jerk reaction is to apply a sort of intelligence security focus as if that were the panacea for the problem. Is there one key stakeholder? No, definitely not. I think there are, and that's part of the problem. There are so many. And they do not work together. So they should, but that's easier said than done. In terms of key policy or key activities, we do not live in an ideal world. There are perhaps we're overestimating our ability to actually contain and control situations in parts of the world, and but at least we should try by developing a more comprehensive approach to the issues at hand, by first of all understanding better what it is we're up against, how multifaceted that is, and therefore what kind of multi-dimensional response is required. Clearly, a securitization of the problem will not solve it. On the contrary.
Thank you, Mark. So an hour discussion about a very difficult subject with a lot of different angles, a lot of different stakeholders, and of course apparently no solution to this problem. And of course we didn't expect that. But I thank all of you for sharing your ideas with us. If I look at the last answers, it's probably we need to know more, lack of knowledge, awareness, naivete, and not learning enough from past experiences. Well, what else could you expect from representatives of think tanks and academia? But it is an important thing that we have to be aware of. We need to share ideas. We need to have more of these Google Hangouts and other kinds of meetings to learn from each other and see if when we are developing this comprehensive or wide approach that we try to learn from each other what elements do work. We can learn, and I know that there are some countries that have very good results with certain policies, and let's try to learn very quickly as much as possible from each other. So this is not the end of the discussion. This will be the end of this Google Hangout. I thank those that have been watching this. I also thank those that have commented. We didn't have that much time to react to all the questions and remarks that you formulated, but the discussion will continue also at the in the forum of the Massive Open Online course, Terrorism and Counterterrorism. There are a number of threats that you could react to, and I very much encourage you to participate. The only way we can deal with this problem is by sharing ideas, and I'm very happy that so many of you have done so. I would like to conclude by thanking the three speakers and thanking Jeanine for organizing this. So thank you very much for your participation, and I hope we'll meet in the future to continue this very difficult discussion and learn more about this phenomenon. So thank you very much, Daan, Raffaello.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.